Hello, patrons. Welcome to this first discussion in our soundtrack club. Uh, Bloodworth here with Ben Moore,
Yo.
joining me for the first time. As I said, it's not really planned to be like a show, so it's going to be pretty raw discussion. But go through some things, and this month what we're talking about the medium. We're talking about East 9. And we're going to talk about Metroid Prime, which was one of the
Special
submissions.
treat. Yeah.
Yeah, from the patrons. Ben, I want to start off with the medium.
Okay.
I got this from Steam. That's what they basically told me it was available. It was like $10 on Steam. I'm like, okay. But anytime you put Akira Yamaoka his name out there, like, okay, I gotta check this out.
Well, not only Akira Yamaoka, but Mary E. McLynn as well.
Yeah.
Who is like they're just basically making Silent Hill songs, and it's awesome.
Yeah, because that's one of the funny things with this is I sort of went down that rabbit hole a little further than I had in the past because I've always been a slight I've always respected Silent Hill more from afar, so I hadn't ever really gotten that deep into the series and researched any of this stuff, and so really where I caught on to this pairing was with Shadows of the Damned.
Oh.
And I didn't like that game, but I got that soundtrack, and I just listened to that soundtrack over and over and over again. And so
I haven't played that game since it came out, but I remember loving that game.
I only played it I think when I did the review, and I was hard out after that. But soundtrack had a place to come back to. So I'm very interested in this. And what's funny though is that even with that, I knew Yamaoka's name, but I didn't know that she was that tied to his work, in terms of doing the vocals and even the lyrics on a lot of this stuff. And so I saw the name there on the track listing, and okay, let me look her up. Let me see, because it sounds a lot like the same person in Shadows of the Damned. So I'm look it up. It's oh yeah, sure is. And not only is she there, but she's in a lot of the Silent Hill stuff, and so was Troy Baker apparently in Shadows of the Damned stuff.
Have you heard "You're Not Here" from Silent Hill 3? It's the
Likely,
Silent Hill 3 title track. It's really good. Yeah.
Yeah. And then just finding out about all the other stuff that she's done. And so it just like I said, went down the rabbit hole on this. And we'll get to the specific songs later. So I think that's one of the fun things that this kind of endeavor is. It's throwing me into this. It's kind of the intention, right? It's throwing me into these holes and these branches, and it's I never really paid attention to this before, and now I am, and
yeah, definitely.
This all makes sense.
It's really neat, Blood, and I'm so glad that you're doing this project because every once in a while I'll have something where I'll listen to the music outside of the game, a Persona 5 or something like that. But for the most part, I tend to appreciate music in the game while I'm playing, and you definitely don't get a comprehensive appreciation of the music. You're focused on the objectives, and
right.
Maybe a song will stand out here and there that you'll latch onto. And so it was nice kind of being able to kind of just consume this in its entirety and kind of appreciate it just on its own merits.
And now, worth noting, the medium is not just Akira Yamaoka, also Arkadiusz Rakovsky. It's going to be my best guess.
I think that was... I mean, I don't know, but I think that was pretty good.
Also credited here. What's interesting is, at least the way the Steam soundtrack is presented, you don't really get a breakdown. You don't see who did what necessarily, and so there are tracks in there that this is clearly Yamaoka's sound, and so I know that he worked on that. But in terms of the split, how much involvement did Yamaoka have in the bulk of this score and soundtrack versus Rakovsky, and maybe a lot of this ambient stuff is both of them working together, or maybe it's just one or the other. It's kind of hard to tell until you get those like really signature like guitar tracks and vocal tracks in there. But with the kind of overall, the stuff that you hear most of the time, it is more brooding, droning kind of ambient kind of tracks. And there's a lot of interesting things going on there, but it's, you know, you kind of, it's about setting that mood. And I think there's actually a point then in the game, or no, not in the game, when I was listening to the soundtrack and I was in that space so well that like I like heard something else happen in the room or outside, and like I had like a slight jump scare.
Nice.
But it's, yeah, this kind of like drone stuff. I have a friend that does this kind of music in a sense too, and it's a sort of thing where like you just put the headphones on and you just kind of soak in it. You don't necessarily like listen to every, there's not necessarily a lot of melodies going on, but there's all these kind of like metallic clanging bits and, you know, textures going on, and things just kind of moving about in the background.
There was definitely one track where it had a very strong industrial vibe, and I was like, this could be a Nine Inch Nails instrumental. Like you could totally tell me that, and I would believe you 100%. And I would say, and this is going to sound, I think, more critical than I mean it to, but out of the 3 soundtracks that we're discussing today, this was probably the least memorable to me. And it's not even that I think it's bad, but I think the ambient tracks certainly serve their purpose. And you and I have gotten into this conversation before, where some game soundtracks are easier to appreciate as you're going through the game as an accompaniment, and some really stand up on their own. And I definitely think for a lot of these tracks, they're not super interesting to listen to on their own. You know, they're just there to kind of present a sense of dread. However, I will say, there, as you mentioned, there is some interesting things going on. The way that they use vocals in some of them are pretty cool. There's one, or actually there's a couple where there's like this chanting, like, ha, ha, ha,
yeah,
ha, and it's
like
just
the sadness theme, or it's just, yeah, there's this weird, playful bouncing around of the vocals.
Yeah, I thought that was very effective. And another one, I think it's when you're getting chased by that creature.
Yeah.
You actually like hear its grunts in the song, and I thought that was a really nice touch. It kind of made it like more animalistic in a way, and I really liked that. And I'm going to struggle to describe this, so forgive me, audience, but there was another track that really stood out where it almost sounded like it was being played through like an old record player or something. Like it was kind of like broken and distant, like it was going through some sort of filter. It also kind of gave me a Silent Hill vibe, but just sort of this like distorted. It was a really just like you're in another world kind of vibe, which is of course incredibly consistent and evocative of the game itself and its themes. And so I really like that as well.
Yeah, there's one where I wrote down it's a track called Echoes, where it says, like, I wrote down, it sounds like breathing underwater, whatever that means.
Right.
And it does get like a little bit jazzy in the middle, but there's a lot of this stuff, and like what you're saying with there's some heavy breathing that's in parts of the tracks, and kind of creaking and growling and radio static.
Yeah.
And then when you get chased by the monsters, you definitely get more of the mechanical, industrial kind of rhythms going on.
I would say the vocal tracks are definitely a standout, and if you only listen to a couple of tracks from this, I would definitely listen to the vocal tracks. So there's 3 of them. Let's see, I have their names here.
Yeah, it's Fade, which is the duet with Troy Baker, and then Across the Shore, and then Voices, which I think is at the very, very end.
So, Fade, I really liked the duet. I just thought the way that they implemented the vocals, like the lyrics felt like a little clunky for the song. to me. Like I thought the actual performance itself was good, but the rhythm of the words didn't flow as well for me as I would have liked. However, the other two I thought were very strong, especially Voices. I loved.
Yeah.
It truly is a beautiful song. It put me right back into the prime of Silent Hill, which has absolutely incredible music, and honestly, Voices to me goes toe to toe with a lot of the best stuff from Silent Hill. So.
Yeah, I think one of the things that makes Voices different, and I think all of them have really good lyrics in terms of just like they're meaningful in the sense that they kind of tell a story and they kind of put you back into like, okay, this was what's going on with these characters, and it all feels very relevant to what's going on. But I think what makes Voices stand out a little bit more is just that it brings in that full band vibe. The others are a little bit softer, a little bit slower mood, whereas with Voices you kind of get in the middle and then just the drums and the guitars kick in, and there's this sense of because it's sort of about her, it's about Marianne, it's about hearing the voices of the dead and like living through that and struggling for that and like wanting kind of a release from that. And so when the music kicks in, it emphasizes like that sense of like desperation. It's like, just get this over with, just let me go.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's definitely, there was a point where I was like, okay, let me listen to these three over and over, and like, which one of these is my favorite? And I just kept coming back to that.
Yeah, Voices was definitely my favorite of the three, but I think they're all worth listening to.
Yeah.
And yeah, like I said, if you really want to slim it down to just a few songs, I think those 3 vocal tracks are a highlight, certainly.
Also worth noting that the opening track, it doesn't have vocals, but it does have a lot of that same kind of instrumentation with guitars and the band.
Yeah, that's a good point. That is another one that definitely stood out for sure. If you're a fan of the Yamaoka style, it definitely blends right into other work that he's done. That one. I actually looked up all of these soundtracks on YouTube and found seemingly good sources for all of them. So Black Screen Records, which only has 164 subscribers, but they have the full soundtrack there.
Yeah.
If you're just looking for an easy way to access it, or Steam, like you mentioned.
Yeah, the annoying thing with the Steam ones, I don't know why they did this way, but for the track titles, they put like everything in the track title. So it's like both of their names, the name of the soundtrack, and then the actual title of the track is the last thing. So like I had to like pull my window all the way open to see, like, what is the name of this track?
Yeah, that's a lot.
So that's one thing I'll probably get into with this. Sometimes I get these annoyances with how soundtracks are handled. And there's one that I hadn't had before.
Yeah.
Ys 9.
Yeah.
Then,
I'm really excited to talk about this.
Yeah, so what's funny is the concept of this is like I would bring one that's a recent release and I'd ask somebody else to bring one, and we bring one from the community. This one you didn't exactly bring because I asked you to be on the show. Is like I said I was interested in talking about Ys 9, and then like, well, I want to be on to talk about that.
Yeah, right.
I was originally going to have somebody else, yeah.
Yeah.
I personally got this on iTunes. It's like $21. It's not too bad. But yeah, I mean, yeah, you start off. Let me know what you're thinking. What stood out to you for this? It's opposite direction entirely from the last one.
Yeah, just quick shout out to the Falcom Music channel. If I remember correctly from my interview, they just let people access all their music for free. It might be a little bit more nuanced than that, but it's been a couple of years since that interview. But if I remember correctly, it's something along those lines. And so a lot of tracks, 62 tracks on this thing. And Blood, listening through this got me extremely excited about this show. Like, I feel like I could be on every episode with you just because of my experience of listening to the soundtrack. And I haven't even finished the game yet. But my previous experiences with Falcon games, I've always been super impressed with the music. I've been very impressed with the Ys music, and that's no different here. there are a lot of things that I think play to my personal tastes. So heavy metal, particularly thrash metal, black metal, power metal, death metal are my favorite genres of music. I adore it. And the way that some of these songs play out, especially when they go hard, it's just shredding. It's shredding accompanied by strings, and it sounds wonderful. But I think if it was just that, it would get exhausting. It would get a little one note. And for, a soundtrack as large as this, I think my number one takeaway is how all over the place it is in terms of instrumentation, in terms of genre, that makes it so incredibly appealing. They do a ton of different sounds, and I would say I like them kind of all equally. There's a beautiful waltz in here. There's some great piano tracks. And
There's
even
actually quite a lot of waltz in there. Yeah, like I think that it's funny because like when I started thinking about this soundtrack, in terms of like describing it, like the first thing that popped to my head was like typical Japanese music, and I'm like, what the crap does that mean? But I think in a way it's sort of like this kind of blending of like waltz and metal that I don't feel like happens in a lot of other genres or in a lot of Western soundtracks. It's I feel like a lot more Western soundtracks are informed by, film scoring, and they evoke more of that kind of thing, whereas Japanese stuff seems to go more into the classical, more into the ballets and the waltzes, and you feel those kinds of elements come up a lot more. And then like you were saying with this, it's like you'll have a string section and then it'll bounce over to a guitar section and then it'll like throw a saxophone in, and it kind of makes all that stuff work together in a really quick way that works with this game.
Definitely. I do want to do a clarification. The Falcom Music channel is not an official Falcom channel, but they have a free music policy that allows them to upload music to this channel. So that's a more exact way of saying what I was trying to say. So I apologize for the earlier error. But yeah, Blood, I completely agree. And to kind of bounce off of that, I think something, JRPGs is a genre that is sort of one of the reasons it's so beloved is because of the music. I would say more than some other gaming genres. And the issue that I have sometimes is it can bleed together a little bit, where once you start playing a lot of these games, you feel like you kind of hear the same sort of motifs over and over again. And you get some of that here, definitely. I don't want to say like it's completely exempt from it, because I was listening to a track and I went down to the YouTube comments and they were like, this just sounds exactly like a Dragon Quest song. And I was like, you're right. You could put this in Dragon Quest, like everything about it.
That's the funny thing, because I was going to say that there was a track, I think it's just called Prison City. And when I heard that in game, that's just you're just exploring town.
Yeah.
You're just wandering around, finding treasure chests and stuff. But there is a part in there, about a minute or so in, that just hit me like a Dragon Quest song, like one of those town themes. But it hit me in the right way, to where it's like, you know what? I'm in for this game.
Yeah.
Like it was sort of like that moment, that feeling where I'm just gonna play through this game. That was kind of the decision maker.
It's really fascinating, Blood, because in Ys 9, there's definitely sort of gothic elements to the game, and especially in their monstrum form, there's kind of an edginess to those characters, but it doesn't come across like that in the game. Like playing through it, there's kind of a levity to it, there's a lightheartedness to it that I think is very enjoyable, and I think the soundtrack is actually able to kind of perfectly capture all of that, where, like, because of some of the instrumentation, some of these tracks definitely have a very gothic sound to them. It leans into that. But it never gets dominated by that. There are also plenty of tracks that I would describe, like it's the Dandelion bar track is just very cozy and warm and welcoming, which is perfect for the very laid back vibe you have when you're in that spot in the game.
Yeah. Yeah, and so the Grimwald Nox tracks, I think what you're talking about are the
Yeah.
ones that definitely feel more like Castlevania type vibes. I don't think I have a specific example, but there are parts too where the guitars just kind of reminded me of like a Mega Man X a couple of times. But yeah, but it's interesting is that it's not a game, even though that's a game that's very focused on its characters. You get a chapter to introduce each of the main characters. It doesn't have character themes, and so I think Prillis has one, but I don't think there's anything else that I could associate with like Hawk or White Cat or anything. And
there was a song that reminded me of the doll that kind of seemed like it would fit her, but I'm not sure if it was actually associated with.
Yeah, it's actually one of I think the one that you're thinking of it's titled Marionette.
Yeah, okay.
And it's one of the ones that I highlighted as well, and it's interesting because you're talking about the different places it goes. It's like a dulcimer being backed by like a thumping bass track, and then and the saxophone comes in.
Oh, Blood! I'm so glad you said that.
Yeah.
The saxophone is actually like a secret star of the soundtrack. I wouldn't say they use it a ton, but when it shows up, it really stands out, and you're like, yeah more sax. Totally. Yes.
Yeah, it's
yes.
not super frequent, but there's that one, and there's a dungeon track called North Wind that like goes from piano into guitar and then into sax, and then they all kind of like jump in together, that I really like. But yeah, it's one of the things that I said about Ys 9 in general, that like speed is one of the game's assets, and I feel like that is very much backed up by the soundtrack. Like when you get into a lot of the dungeons, like things are just moving. It's like, hey, let's go. It's not about setting up some, like we were talking about with Medium. It's not about setting up some moody, let's tell the story of the environment and all this stuff. It's like, nah, dude, run and like hit some things.
Yep. Yeah, it's funny because when I saw that there were 62 tracks to get through, I was kind of like, oh boy, like this is gonna be a lot. And I think there was there's probably more, but there's only one track that I remember not enjoying, or that didn't land for me, and it felt like almost like a kind of a circusy, more of a jokey. I'm trying to see if I can find the title of it. But it just didn't. It came across more as grating than fun, which is what I think the vibe that it was trying to go for. But other than that, I really had a blast, and again, the variation of all this stuff made it so easy to listen to. Like I could totally, outside of needing to do it for the show, I could totally see myself throwing this on and enjoying it, or be grinding away in something, and throwing it on and having a good time.
Yeah, I had a long drive last week, and I put that on my phone and just basically had that be the playlist for the whole way, and yeah, it was great. One of the funny things about the speed is that there are a lot of the battles you can just be over with really quickly, so you don't get to hear, even though these tracks are not that long, a lot of them are like 2.5 minutes.
Yeah.
There are still parts of these tracks that I hadn't really heard, because you would just get into a battle in town and fight the things, and then that'll be over, and you've heard the beginning of the song over and over, but you haven't heard that whole track. Yeah.
No, that's a really good point, and something that I think our jobs allow us to appreciate a little bit more is there are times where, because we capture music that we can use in reviews, and so like specifically focusing on music, it's like, oh, I probably maybe wouldn't have heard this full track before, but because I'm capturing it, I get to kind of focus in on it a little bit more, which is nice.
All right, let's switch over to our last one, which I would say kind of falls in the middle of these. We've got the ambient, and then you've got the stuff moving, and then you've got Metroid Prime, which does a bit of both.
Man, Metroid Prime is one of those games where it's like, what am I going to say that hasn't already been said a bazillion times? But it really bears repeating. Like, obviously, a Stone Cold classic, right? A deeply beloved game for good reason. But just isolating the soundtrack on its own, this is just a hardcore collection of bangers. Like, this music is so phenomenal and so distinct and so... It calls upon, like, it has the identity of Metroid, but is also able to stand out as its own thing.
Mm-hmm.
There were even tracks that I was listening to, and I was like, this is kind of reminding me of, like, Daft Punk or early Daft Punk. Like, there's sort of, like, this, like, EDM vibe running through some of these tracks.
That's funny that you say that, because it's something I hadn't thought about, but once we get into it, there's definitely parts where I had that feeling as well. The one thing I'll say is, even compared to past Metroid games, this game is more ambient in the sense that, like we were saying with the medium, there's always stuff moving around. Stuff moving ear to ear. There's these buzzing, there's these, chirps, there's things that you can't quite identify, stuff echoing off in the distance. And so even when you get into something that's a little bit more focused on a melody, that stuff's still going on. Creating this sense of space that I think is really good for bringing the franchise into 3D.
Yeah, I think that is extremely well said, Blood. Kind of in comparison to the medium, and obviously, very different games trying to accomplish extremely different things, so not a one-to-one comparison. But I would say a lot of times, or at least what stood out to me in the Metroid Prime soundtrack, is even when the game is being ambient, right? There is still a melody to it. There is something kind of like it has this strong structure to it. It has kind of this driving force that's pushing the song forward in a way that I think makes it enjoyable to listen to on its own outside of the environments that it's accompanying.
So you're talking about things reminding you of Metroid, and this is the rabbit hole that I got down, which other people have probably already picked apart and examined and put up full YouTube videos of, but there's stuff in this listen through that I just didn't pick up on it that specifically before.
Yeah, I probably missed this entirely.
And there are 3 songs that are oh crap, this is just the old music that I didn't realize was the old music. So the opening theme, which at first I recognized as okay, this is the opening of Super Metroid, right? That wah, wah, wah kind of thing, right? Mm-hmm. But then I'm wait a minute. I went back to the original Metroid, and that's the same theme too. It's just on the NES, it's so harsh and just grating it almost in a way that they soften it up a lot in Super Metroid, and then in Metroid Prime they soften it up, and then they use it as a bed underneath of the Metroid Prime theme. So that was crazy to me. It's oh crap, this is the original Metroid. This is the original NES song the whole time, and I didn't catch it. And then similarly, the Parasite Queen, the boss fight in the space station at the beginning, I always had this sort of sense of oh, this sound, it's kind of sounds like, the big organs that they use sort of to emphasize the boss fights in Super Metroid. But then I got to listening to it more, and it's a similar thing, to where it's no, this is actually the mother brain fight from Super Metroid, but there's just got all this other stuff on top of it.
That's awesome.
Kind of distract you. And then the one that really got me is that the Talon 4 Overworld, it is basically the NES Brinstar theme, just slowed way the heck down. And it gets, once you get further into it, it starts to become a little bit more obvious. But again, it's just even early on, it's those notes, it's okay, listen and go to Brinstar NES, and oh crap, yep, that lines up.
Yeah.
And there's obviously, some things that are more overt. One of them, that's unmissable is the Magmore Caverns, which reuses the Lower Norfair theme from Super Metroid. And the funny thing is that one's always been even though I love that song, it's always been sort of a slight disappointment to me, because it's pretty much exact. The sample quality is different, but it's that's the same song. And the reason it's disappointing is because in Super Metroid, that moment just hits so hard.
Yeah.
It's you get down there and there's just fire flying all over the place, and you have these really difficult enemies, and it just feels like you're at war. You know, you've got the pounding drums and the vocals. And in Magmore, it's just like, okay, you're in lava, but it's not quite. It's you're not at that climax of the game in the same sense.
That's really funny because I can't think of it in the context of Super Metroid. Like, nothing is coming to mind. But if I had to pick, like, I don't know, 5 tracks from Metroid Prime, or maybe even 3 tracks, like Magmore would be one of them that I would pick. And it is kind of relaxing in a way, but I feel like, I don't know, it's just a track that I immediately latch onto and love, just because I think the way that game is structured and the way you kind of go through that area back and forth, that the vibe of that is correct. Like, it's just the right level of intensity for the way that I feel like you travel through it, I guess. But it's interesting. I'd love to, like, actually hear your perspective, because I definitely think that's a very interesting take.
Yeah. Well, that's the funny thing, though, is because, like, I love that song, right? Like, you know, and you know, definitely, like, one of my favorite video game songs. It's just the fact that it's like, okay, you just took this song that I love and you put it somewhere else.
Right. Sure.
But yeah, it's still an amazing song, regardless, you know, and I have no, like, issues with the song itself.
Something that I just wanted to mention that I was doing is I would, as I was going through the Metroid Prime soundtrack, I was like, this sounds like a Chozo song, like, just immediately, like the chanting and just sort of the mythical vibe that this has. And sure enough, I would look at the song and it's like, yep, this is a Chozo song. And I always love when anything can do that, really, where, like, you go into a place where, you know, you're supposed to give an element of your game a very specific vibe, and I think Metroid Prime captures that perfectly with the way that it kind of presents this civilization.
Yeah, and I think some of those Chozo tracks, the thing I highlighted there was, like, there's, like, a noisy emptiness. You know, and again, going back to that, you know, what we're talking about with the ambient nature, it's just like, there's just, feels like there's just always something out of the corner of your eye, like some shake or some noise or some gargle, and like, what is this place, you know? But at the same time, even though that stuff is prevalent, it doesn't feel like, you know, it's distracting. One that was interesting that I hadn't remembered was the Flogra boss, which is like a big plant thing.
That was another one that really stood out to me. And it's funny because I even listening to it, my response to it was, wow, this is a really a standout track. I really like this. But I didn't associate it with that boss at all, just because I think, you know, going through the boss, trying to, like, hit those panels and turn into the morph ball and go, and, like, I just was too wrapped up in the mechanics of the game to appreciate the song.
Yeah, and so it feels like it has a bit of a callback to Spore Spawn from Super Metroid in there, the other plant. But then, this is where we get into this point in the game where we start to get, like, these dancey, bouncy bits, particularly in the second half of this fight. And where really that element seems to really come up to me is when you get into the later Talon Overworld and Phendrana areas, where, so when you're first going in there, like the initial Phendrana bit that's more quiet, like, that's definitely one of the things, whenever you hear, like, whenever you say Metroid Prime soundtrack, my head starts playing Phendrana Drifts, like, immediately. Just there's something about, like, that piano and the way it, like, it hits, like, it sounds like snowflakes hitting your visor kind of a thing, and it really, like, stands out. But when you go back to Talon and Phendrana later on, it's kind of like the game is, there's more rhythm there, there's, like, cymbals hitting, like I said, there's more of, like, a dance beat to it, and it just sort of, and there's more melody that comes in later as well, and sort of it creates a sense of transitioning from initially you're stepping out into the unknown. You don't know what's going on. You don't really know where you're at. You're trying to get the lay of the land. But now when you return to these places, it's like you're more confident. You know, you're on a mission. I'm going to cross from over here to over there. I'm going to go to that door that I could see before, but I couldn't get to, and I'm much more comfortable in this space than I was before. And then I guess the other one I wanted to maybe, in terms of like something that like really cements in my head, like the soundtrack, is the crashed frigate, the underwater theme, because it's just one of those songs that when it plays, like I just see it.
Gotcha.
You know, I see like going down those platforms, getting deeper and deeper underwater.
Yeah.
And it's just very, you know, it's quiet and it's subtle and it's, you know, it gives that sense of being underwater, but I see that level when it plays.
It's funny because I think in previous Metroid games, before Metroid Prime, you know, obviously the Metroid creatures themselves had a strong identity with that very recognizable cry, but I think of the Metroid Prime title screen and just kind of like that, like almost like squirming electricity sound that it has, the like cackling sound, and then you have like the cells dividing or whatever in the title screen. I feel like that sound kind of fits the way that I think of these Metroid creatures, you know, with like this like clear membrane. I think it just kind of made them more fully identified. And again, you know, you're talking about the transition to 3D. It just kind of gave the game, I think, a more elaborate, sort of like scientific almost feel. And of course, that's emphasized by some of like the lab settings that you go through in the game, and the scanning and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I even wrote down that the final Metroid Prime fight sounds like fighting a science project. There's a lot of liquidy sounds in there. But yeah, I almost forgot to talk about that menu theme. Like, that is just a banger.
Yes, it is.
There's so many times like you go to play that game, like, I'm just gonna sit here before I hit start and listen to this song.
I looked at it just to double check, and I guess at the title screen, like, you don't see cells dividing, but you know what I mean, like sort of a biological.
Yeah, there's definitely some textures and stuff going on, biological things going on in the background. Yeah. But yeah, it was very cool to go back to this and like I said, just to pick up on things that I hadn't really picked up on before, even if, you know, again, some music theorist has broken it all down.
Right. Yeah. I've said this before, Blood, but I love music. I mean, outside of games, I would say music is my second biggest passion, but it's so, and I'm not practiced in it the way that I am articulating about games, but it's so hard, I think, putting what I love about music or why I love a particular track into words sometimes.
Oh, it's super hard.
Yeah, I feel like I'm just like kind of approximating what I really feel a lot of the times. But it was truly a treat to get to go through these soundtracks, and I think it was a really good selection of soundtracks as well. It does make me mad that they haven't released the Prime trilogy on Switch yet. They should really do that. Sure. But
well, and I don't think there's an easy way, like other than like YouTube videos. I don't think there's an easy way to get a hold of this. I have a CD from Japan from 20 years ago, but I don't think you can just go out and buy that.
I would love like a remastered version of the soundtrack just to see what that sounds like. I mean, the way the treatment that they did for like the Xenoblade soundtrack, I really loved and was such a treat. And so I would love to see something like this for Metroid Prime, which is absolutely a game that deserves it.
Cool. Well, yeah, I think, to me, like, listening to the soundtracks is probably more important than even talking about them, and somehow I've managed to talk longer than I thought I would be capable of. But yeah, thanks for joining me in this first discussion, this first experiment, and thank you to everyone in the Soundtrack Club.